Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for the very interesting comments that everybody's mentioned on the panel. As a Spanish entrepreneur, I find myself a little bit like a German pharmacist, so I understand all the challenges that everybody's been mentioning. I think that I'm going to stick to the two questions that you mentioned, that were mentioned in the program. Has Spain learned from its mistakes? I remember in 2011 when I live in London and I used to come to Spain, and people would ask me, what is the capital of Spain? I used to say zero. There was no capital. And the biggest problem that Spain had was precisely what we hear every day in mainstream economics to be the solution for the European Union. Spain is exactly the example of what we should not do. In 2008, Spain, after a massive real estate bubble, lost 40 billion euros of tax revenues that came from that real estate bubble, and decided to do what everybody in the mainstream economic agenda would recommend, which is to spend. And it decided to spend like there is no tomorrow. In fact, when I last went to Argentina, to Buenos Aires, I explained to my friends in Argentina, a country that is not precisely known for its sound economic policies, that Spain went into a 10% public deficit and a 10% trade deficit at the same time, and they think that we were crazy, and we were. And we were. Between 2008 and 2011, Spain entered into an absolutely monstrous, expansive and expensive deficit program. So much that the accumulated deficit reached 625 billion in 4 years. That those 625 billion were spent wisely in airports with no planes, that look like the Death Star, by the way. If you go to any of those airports, they're absolutely amazing to look at. Until
That's cool.
That's cool. It is cool if you don't have to pay for it. Right? We have to pay for it. Public stimulus. You go to any village in Spain, you will find that in every corner there are these absolute monstrosities of statues that you probably don't know were paid with public money. Anyway, the situation was so bad that in 2011, the new government found itself not only with the burden of a 10% fiscal deficit and a 10% trade deficit, but 40 billion euros of unpaid bills to SMEs, but another 40 billion euros of delayed invoices from the regional communities, and a 65 billion capital hole in the public banking system. So it was almost impossible. I was on CNBC on the 31st of December of 2011, and they said to me, it is absolutely impossible that Spain will reach some level of growth in the next 20 years. It is absolutely impossible. However, it happened. It happened, and we did learn a few things. We did learn a few things. If we look at the last budget that was approved, well, that is in process of being approved in Spain, we can see, for example, that infrastructure spending has not been touched at all in the last 8 years. That is a good thing. You can see that, for example, the public spending to GDP remains between 3 to 5 points below the average of the comparable countries in the European Union, which is a good thing. You can see that, for example, the tax cuts that were implemented in 2015 and 2016 have led to an increase in revenues of more than the growth in nominal GDP. So things have started to work. So things have started to work, and there are positive things there. What are the negatives? The negatives are what most of my esteemed colleagues have mentioned here. The first one, obviously, is that we have a tremendous amount of bureaucracy. It is a country in which it is very, very complicated to start a business. It is very onerous to hire people. Labor tax reform was positive, and it stopped the bleeding in the labor market, but it is still a very expensive country to hire people. Me, as an entrepreneur with a business in London and a business in Madrid, it cost me 20% more to hire somebody with the same net revenue for the worker. It cost me 20% more to me in Madrid than it cost me in London. And Madrid is considered a tax haven in the rest of Spain. And everybody's talking, somebody said it over here, about this atrocious concept of harmonizing. Harmonizing in Spain means raising. No one has ever talked about harmonizing to the level of Madrid. No? Madrid doesn't have inheritance tax, and other regions want to implement it. So we did learn a lot of things, and I think that is, I would say, the positive thing that we can say out of it. And in effect, what was deemed to be impossible ended up being possible. 3.5%, 3.2%, 3.3% growth of GDP, more than 500,000 jobs created a year, and a much more improved economic outturn. Very important, coming back to what my esteemed colleague from Italy was mentioning, a massive financial sector reform, in which the financial sector was literally stripped down to let everybody see and decide what was viable, what was solvent, and what was, and that made a huge difference in terms of attracting capital and returning to confidence. So confidence is there. What is the problem? The problem is that, and it's, yes, exactly 2 minutes. The biggest problem is that in this latest budget, Spain still will spend 11% more than it spent in 2011. That it's still a deficit country. It is still a deficit country. We have a primary surplus and we have a low trade deficit, but it's still a deficit. It is still a problem because 65% of the parliament in Spain wants to spend between 60 to 65 billion more in their economic programs, and the other part wants to spend only another 35 billion. So we have, in general, a lot of people really wanting to come back to 2007. And in this sense, it is extremely important for the European Union to be decisive. It is extremely important for the European Union to be decisive because Spain has been an example for many things, but it cannot be an example of going back to the mistakes of the past. And we cannot whitewash populism by giving them 20% of what they demand, because voters, when you give them 20% of what the populists want, say, what's the difference between 20 and 100%? So the big Spain is not only a hope for the European Union and for the peripheral countries and for Greece and for so many other countries, with all of its challenges that it has, but it is also the biggest threat. It is also the biggest threat because if we give in to the populist messages, to the populist demands, the European Union will not survive the next crisis, and it's a very large economy that cannot go under. Thank you very much. Okay,